where they expect also to set targets to member states, including in the field of sovereignty. And we see that acceleration into centering sovereignty again, probably because of realization of risk of data losses or threats, including data transfers to the US after Schrems 2 case, but also the pandemic has kind of exacerbated the kind of risk of outages, especially of critical infrastructures in Europe and elsewhere. But also, I think the increased kind of awareness, including among people, about our dependency to big tech and to big tech services and infrastructures, whether in our schools, university, our health system, and others. So I'm really happy to dive into that discussion and really understand where is the consideration for our human rights in this debate, and how both the dependency on big tech, but also solutions that are centering sovereignties affect all of us, and especially people at the margins. So I want to welcome Seda Gerses, who is Associated Professor at the Faculty of Tech Policy and Management at the Technical University of Delft in the Netherlands. Welcome. Estelle Massé, who is Legislative Manager and Global Data Protection Lead at Access Now. Welcome, Estelle. And Frank Karliszek, who is the founder and the CEO of Nextcloud. Welcome. And I wanted to start this discussion with the same question, if you can answer briefly, of course. I understand that it's a very vast topic. To understand, what is your definition of digital and technological sovereignty, and what do you think it should be? I'll start with Estelle.
Thank you. Thank you for the invitation, and congrats to Edri on another great privacy camp. So this conversation, I think, is really about power. And the definition to me, I think there could be two on what I think different actor means by it and what it should mean, or it could mean for us and for people who are at the moment not representing in this conversation. What I mean by power is that it's a result of a power dynamic and a power struggle, mostly between private actors and government, where governments are realizing, as you mentioned, Claire, that we're slowly losing control over critical infrastructure, over infrastructure in general. And there is this sort of pushback and callback of government trying to regain that control. And this is where the word sovereignty comes into place, in order to regain some degree of autonomy and don't have to depend on those private actors when you want to develop COVID tracing apps, for instance, when you want to develop health system, when you want to develop school automated system, things like that. But the point that is missing in those conversations at the moment is, what is the sovereignty component for internet users, for app users, and for people in general? It's a power dynamic between two actors that are supposed to be serving a third one that is not represented in those conversations, and it is which role is not interpreted there. And so when we're having conversation about digital sovereignty, we should actually have a conversation about digital checks and balances, and what elements of control we can put back for the users that are supposed to be served by the public and private services at its core.
Thank you so much for that framing discussion in terms of power. Frank, what is your definition?
It's really hard to say this in just a few words. It's really about being in control of your digital destiny, your digital life. The interesting thing about digital sovereignty is that it's a term that is a meaning from a government perspective. The government should be sovereign, but also for individuals, because also like people should be in control of their digital life, basically. And as Estelle already said, the interesting thing is that private actors like big tech is in control at the moment as a de facto. I mean, not legally, but as de facto they're controlling the digital destiny of most of the world. And that's something that's not healthy on many aspects, from an individual perspective, privacy, but also from an economic perspective. It's just not, such a huge concentration of power is just not healthy for the planet. And I think digital sovereignty is a term that for me means that people should be in control of their life more. Government, smaller companies, individuals, and not be de facto controlled by big IT companies somewhere else, especially if they're not even respecting local legislation, because they're just based in another part of the world. So that's what it means for me.
Thank you. Seda.
Great. So thanks, Claire, for having us here, and congratulations on the Privacy Camp 10th edition. Super exciting. I just want to take a little bit of a historical view on both computing itself and terms of digital sovereignty. I'd like to invite you to think about computing as a post-World War II control technology. So it's great that the term control came up in both Estelle and Frank's introduction, but I would like to think about computing as a technology of control that we have now been able to expand to the point that we can apply it to all the things. To open up that some more, in the middle of the 20th century, powerful political and economic forces, especially post-World War II, gave rise to computing. Computers were a technological innovation of control, and to be more specific, operational control. It was informed by World War II management of military. The technology was also informed by deep distrust in humans following the use of the nuclear bomb and many other atrocities of World War II, and the desire to build control technologies that had at least two driving forces. They were aimed at removing the autonomy of individuals, something that manifests itself in designs that implement distributed trust, and to build control systems that could bring powerful opponents of the Cold War to their knees. In this history, we see the first instances of a battle for digital sovereignty. Thanks to some great historical work by Ksenia Tatarchenko, we know that in 1966, Charles de Gaulle downgraded France's membership in NATO, which I guess is a military alliance, as many of you know. This semi-departure from NATO had to do with the unfulfilled desire of France to integrate its own nuclear deterrence into the alliance. 3 months after, de Gaulle struck an agreement with the Soviets to do research on computer science. And in general, the reason de Gaulle was taking these actions was because they wanted to challenge American domination of the computing market, and specifically the French computing market. As part of this program, de Gaulle also nationalized a Belgian-Norwegian computer company called Bull, and founded the Institut National de Recherche en Informatique et Automatique, INRIA. This is kind of maybe the first digital sovereignty move, even though it wasn't called that at the time. However, over the decades, developments in computing became more commercialized. What was originally a military technology was enhanced and further developed through what I will shorthand as the business of computing. Moving from mainframes to personal computers to web-based services, the business of computing has given to us what we today consider computational infrastructures. The cloud infrastructures that we have with mobile devices as its accessories, with decreasing autonomy for the individuals because the mobile devices are controlled through the clouds, and there's practically no software production outside of these computational infrastructures, which I know Frank is an alternative to, so we'll come back to that. These computational infrastructures have become so powerful that it's close to impossible to produce software and distribute compute independent of them. And most of the hardware production that we have today, including microprocessors to networking devices, are optimized for their market-driven needs. This is significant. As I said earlier, powerful political, economic, and social forces gave rise to these computational infrastructures with great capabilities of control. What we see now is that these computational infrastructures have become so powerful that they have set free their own economic, political, and social forces. computational infrastructures that have come to threaten the forces that gave rise to them to begin with. For me, therefore, digital sovereignty represents the reflex of nation states forefronted by prominent figures of the Cold War era, grabbing back on known tricks like nationalism, very apparent in the case of US, France, and Germany, market dominance, and claims to global power to respond to the transformations brought about by computational infrastructure. So it's an old bag of tricks applied to respond to, let's call it big tech. And what we've also seen in the last decade is that this response has been extended to include things like the use of open source technologies, data protection, et cetera, to make claims of digital sovereignty. So this is just the kind of political view. There's also an activist view, but let's come back to that in discussion. So it's just, I'll leave it there for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Seda, for this historical perspective. It's quite interesting to see how the concept evolved and how it found its sources also in nationalism. So I'll continue with you. I like to understand like what you think are some of the most problematic aspects of our dominance on big tech and on dominant tech infrastructures and services. What some of us have called like digital colonialism, and how it affects like people at the margin. Also, because to answer Frank's point about taking back control. How can users be in control in a world that is dominated, that we have no choices, and especially the most vulnerable of us. So could you dive into that a little?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are some suggestions as to what we want or aim for from a more activist perspective in terms of digital sovereignty is individual control over our data. I personally think that's a kind of misplaced understanding of the computational infrastructures we have. I think what we see is not only a dependency on somebody else's server, like the cloud, but the fact that the main means through which software reaches millions and billions of people has to go through the few tech companies and the kind of software production practices that they push forward, like microservices or agile development mechanisms and service architectures at all, overall to begin with. And what I see these companies especially doing is trying to they've kind of captured individuals in many ways, right? Like they're in our pockets, they can address us in many ways. I don't think they know anything about us, but they have an infrastructure that makes us addressable through their infrastructures, which gives a lot of companies and governments dependence on them to reach us, right? And so the other market I think that they're now trying to go for through the cloud especially is institutions. So this is kind of what you referred to, Claire, in your opening talk, the way in which, especially with COVID, we saw the acceleration of IT being replaced with cloud-based services. This transformation, let's call it digital transformation, is not just the removal of IT and internal expertise of institutions, but a complete revamping of what it means to be an institution, both in terms of governance, economics, and dependency on technologies of others. So what I see, I can't explain it in great detail, is a kind of gutting out of basic institutions through scalable services that are dependent on the clouds, that are driven by financial forces. I think that if you want to go back to your question on fundamental rights, I do believe that we need institutions to create societies in which individuals can be protected and can practice and exercise their fundamental rights. And if we lose these institutions, that it is impossible for us to exercise our fundamental rights. Now, there's a problem. Institutions have historically, especially in Europe, failed to respond to the needs of underrepresented communities, racialized communities, or they have been actively part of racializing certain communities, especially immigrants. So I think it is on the one hand very depressing that these organizations are being, especially public institutions, are being gutted out by big tech through the service architectures and cloud dependencies. But at the same time, I do think this is a moment to reclaim those institutions, not just technologically, but also in their vision of serving exactly the communities that we're interested in and fundamental rights.
Thank you so much for bringing back the discussion on like how do we do collective advocacy to reclaim these institutions and sometimes move away from the frames that we have. Frank, could you maybe explain also from an insider perspective what some of the European companies but also technologists have done to increase our resilience or sovereignty, but also how did Microsoft in particular, but also other big tech companies have reacted to these moves?
Yeah, happy to. Let me first go back to your earlier questions because I think it's important for the context. I think it's quite fascinating to see what big tech companies, specifically Microsoft, are doing the last few years. So as mentioned already by Seda, Microsoft invented the software licensing business. Right? They invented the business of selling software licenses. And with this business model became like the richest, biggest company in the world, like in the 90s. And they had control over their customers because the software was proprietary, not open source. And they also controlled the file formats, like the Office document file format. So this was basically their way to grab the power and to become the richest company in the world. The file format war was going on like 20 years ago with the push by the EU to create open file formats, basically. But that was not a complete win, but there was some pushback. But it's really interesting because Microsoft decided that this power grab is not even big enough. Like 10 years ago. So they abandoned their own business model with selling software licenses, which they invented and became the biggest, most powerful company in the world. They abandoned this business model and said, okay, we do something even more powerful. We move completely to software as a service, to cloud-based computing. So now you don't even, of course, the software is still proprietary, the file formats are still a problem, but you don't even get the software anymore to install it where you want. You just use software as a service from the cloud, which is then you can pay and then you have access to your file, all the tools, your coworkers, or you stop paying, then you're out. So this is like, and there's no way to migrate it to somewhere else, by the way, because they're not, I mean, maybe you can download the files, but there's no way to export your chat history or your whatever, all your complicated structured data. And even if you could, there's no other application that can read like all these experts. So this is like the biggest power grab ever. And another big interesting aspect is how it works from a contract perspective. So the German government, for example, I have some insights there, has, as every big organization, has contracts with Microsoft. But these were like contracts to get software licenses to be hosted internally as they want. And these contracts are basically transformed from software licensing contracts to cloud software as a service contracts, right? And then basically the governments are forced basically to lose even more control to push into the cloud. And that's something that's obviously a big problem because there's no way out again. This is like the ultimate move. You can never get out of this contracts or this cloud situation anymore. This is why it's so important to really fight back. And there are lots of different levels where you can fight back. There is like, you have to fight back from a contract perspective. And there's some initiatives going on in the governments that these contracts need to be revisited. Then that needs to be open source, self-hosted alternatives. This is like the mission of Nextcloud. So we try to build like this alternative to Microsoft 365, Google Workspace, and so on. But open source, so you can look inside, you can make sure there are no backdoors, you can really see what's happening, and that it's also hosted where you want. You can host the data internally. Like the French government or the German government, there's infrastructure which is just internally, not even connected to the internet. Right? This is not even possible with Google or Microsoft. This only works with open source software. So this is really key. And open source alternatives are also important, like for the poorer areas in the world, right? Not everybody can afford like a Microsoft subscription, right? If you're like a student, like in the underdeveloped region of the world, well, good luck buying a Microsoft subscription to get access to state-of-the-art software. So you really there needs to be open source alternatives. And yeah, that's something that is absolutely key. And then I will stop talking too much. Maybe later I can also talk a little bit about the antitrust complaint, which is another angle that needs to be used to fight Microsoft here.
Thank you. Yes, I have more questions about also what can be done and how can maybe governments and institutions in Europe like promote alternatives and help that move. But I wanted to go to Estelle now and use the data protection framework to question the concept of sovereignty. There's many aspects and it can be quite technical, but what I'm interested to know is from a data protection or a privacy perspective, where data collection, processing, and transfers are happening in a global world. Does sovereignty even make sense? Also because the GDPR has extraterritorial impact. But if sovereignty is not the concept to center, what are then the principles in these cross-border transfers, whether commercial or law enforcement uses?
Thank you. I think to answer this question, I need to continue or build a little bit on what Seda has explained on the historical conversation around digital sovereignty, which was really fascinating. And I only looked at it from a subcomponent of it from the data sovereignty conversation. So I may be missing some point here. So I'd love to further connect with Seda on how to build the two. But I started looking basically over the past few years on how the concept of data sovereignty popped up in Brussels conversation and where this was coming from, where this push was coming from. It really got a lot of wind in Brussels and started being picked up a lot when Commissioner Breton, the French commissioner, arrived and starting putting those discussion around data wars and data control and data sovereignty in Brussels. And so in starting looking a little bit, this came from a lot of conversation also in France around the same concept, sometimes increased around beyond data sovereignty to digital sovereignty on the fact that this assumption that the commissioner also has communicated about that Europe and France a lot of time had lost the quote unquote war on data to the US. And this is something that I personally push back a lot on because I think it's a wrong framing. I think Europe chose a really different path than the US one that was driven by tech and private interest of harvesting data, and Europe chose and tried to resist in more a protective framing, one that people would maintain a certain level of control. But all of this obviously fell through when you're in a scenario where there is those private actors don't only just define the rule of the game, but also become the infrastructure and are able to push back against any legislation that government tried to put forward to try to maintain a level of institution and a level of control for people, just because even though they're technically supposed to be respecting our legislation, they just have de facto, with the control they have over infrastructure, so much power that they are able to influence those legislation just by the type of standards they may be pushing, the type of processes they may be put in place. And this creates this impression from state actors that they have lost the control, that the control is in the end of the US. And what I think they mean by the US here is a group of companies based in the US more than the US government, for instance, and try to wanting to gain back this control. Sorry, this war framing is existing, even though we're not technically in a conflict, but that Europe has to fight back. And because the personal data war, control over personal data was lost toward those private actors, Europe should be gearing up and being prepared of winning what Commissioner Breton is referring to, the industrial data war. So this is where you see the push for sovereign clouds to be there, for data acts to be there in order to try to maintain control over some type of data that should stay in Europe and be controlled by Europe. And a lot of the time here, privacy and data protection arguments are being advanced, and they are positive measure on those fronts. But really, what Seda pointed to is that those points are being used as tool for the greater nationalistic perspective of like, we want this control. We as the state want the control here. And really, ultimately, the goal is not to give us or to give people more privacy or more personal control over this information. And in this context, the data conversation is only one aspect of the larger control grab, power grab that is happening between state and private actors. Now, does this mean that there is no potential for positive changes within those framing that we could be using to our advantage, since, you know, privacy and data protection or other fundamental rights are being advanced by state as a sort of justification for those moves, even though they might not be the underlying rationale to it? I do think there is an overall issue with the rationale that mean that we would always potentially be an outlier in it. And so there is a need to have a conversation of reframing this debate and also making understand the danger of a sovereignty conversation when it's happening between the EU and the US, you know, two big Western countries, and how other countries are picking up on it and using it to justify their abuse. There are data protection law and privacy law being promoted in Egypt, India, and Russia, data protection measures that are actually hurting people and are being discussed over the term saying like it's about data sovereignty, and they're just being used for, you know, the Egyptian government to control what the population is doing, the Indian and Russian government to localize all the data within their borders so that their intelligence authority can look into it and control dissident and journalists, et cetera, et cetera. So by allowing this framing to exist, it is being justified, being used by other countries, and that leads to human rights abuse as well. So there are the danger of that framing in the first place, the danger of issue we're trying to defend being misused and used against us. And there is the losing the perspective of like, okay, you're fighting for a model, you're fighting to, you think, if we think about the EU perspective, you think you lost that war. Okay, fair enough, I disagree. I think we chose a different approach that was a better approach and we should double down on the approach on that. And so you think you lose that part and your reaction is to be, okay, so now we will win the second battle by using the same strategy, even though we already know we lost the infrastructure, and you kind of admit that we do Gaia X, but we still ask those actors that control everything to be the underlying infrastructure. How strategically do you think it's going to go for you? Like, how do you think you're going to win this battle? I think instead, the path for the EU, it's to double down on its approach. It's like, okay, let's be true about protecting human rights, protecting freedom and values, and make sure that we give ourselves a mean to implement the privacy changes we want to do, to implement open source, to implement open government and open data, which are being pushed by a lot of government, actually, as Frank mentioned, and are just not capitalized on it. And this means, you know, reviewing the way EU does investment and put money in innovation. You know, we put forward good legislation, but then we also give a lot of money for like surveillance at the borders everywhere, for surveillance tools to be developed, and that there's not a line in policies there. We develop good legislation, but we don't do any effort in making sure they are enforced and delivered. And so if we're just being a bit logical and where we could want to do, we could open up a different path. I think the sovereignty discussion is just a lose-lose result for the government in the long run and for people in Europe, but also elsewhere on how this framing will be abused, specifically in the context of data. Now, I reckon that my vision on it may be a bit too narrow on data, and there is a larger, I think, digital component of it with infrastructure that Frank and Seda both really delve into, and I'm quite interesting to see how all of them might deal in two places. But it's really creating a lot of, I think, global issue also, and this is what fundamentally is blocking also some of the cross-border data issue that you mentioned, Claire, on like the countries just fighting each other and none of them wanting to reform surveillance with the goal of like being sovereign and controlling, but who lose in this scenario? All of us being surveilled, and tech companies, you know, continuing doing harvesting model because it served those sovereignty and justification.
Thank you so much for that perspective, Estelle. And you already hinted to some of the choices that we are facing, and I'll come back to that after the Q&A. But I wanted, you know, you also name dropped Gaia X, and I wanted to hear from Frank a little bit of the background or your perspective on how that is going, on kind of the original idea and how the project is evolving. And then while you were doing so, I'm also opening the chat for any questions to panel.
Yes, I'm happy to. Yeah, Gaia X, that's an interesting topic. And I'm only sharing here my personal opinion, right? There are like lots of opinions about Gaia X out there. So I personally was involved since the very beginning. It was originally initiated by the German Ministry of Economics and was involved in some discussions at the beginning before it even had its name. The idea was quite clear and bold, which is like Europe needs cloud infrastructure to be able to compete with China and the US. This was the original idea, very clear. I mean, like, I don't know, elevator pitch in one sentence. Then the discussion was, should this be done following the Airbus model? Some of you might remember, or maybe not that old, or know from the history books, how Airbus was founded. It was Europe at the time realized that Europe needs an alternative to Boeing. And Airbus was founded as one huge company with based in different countries, but one big company to build like an alternative to Boeing in Europe. And then the question was, okay, should we do the same for cloud? Should there be a cloud Airbus? And then the decision was that's a bad idea, and I agree with that. And instead, Gaia X is supposed to be a federated system between all those mid-sized cloud companies in Europe. It's basically a set of standards and APIs and open source implementations that connect all the small, medium-sized cloud companies together and become like a virtual hyperscaler, basically. This was the original idea. The idea, I think, was very good. Other governments in Europe joined the initiatives, France first and then several others. And then it was announced and become quite big, at least in press, and hundreds of companies joined this initiative. And then unfortunately a mistake was made, I think, in my opinion. It was allowed that the US cloud companies actually also joined Gaia X. There were a discussion if this is a good idea, because well, the original mission was to have an alternative to them. How can they be a member now? The decision was that, okay, they can be a member, but they don't have any voting rights. And that's okay, they cannot vote, but they're still in the working groups, and they do what they always do. They just like go in there and flood everything with endless discussions, endless papers, endless specifications, endless certifications. And yeah, Gaia X really lost its vision, from my opinion. I'm sure they will produce some certification, some standard, something at some point, but I don't think it will really change the cloud ecosystem in Europe. Sorry, I'm a bit disillusioned there. It's just the usual tactics of big tech. You can also destroy something from the inside, which I think is what's happening here.
Thank you for that, Frank. And I think also it shows the limits of kind of the self-regulatory or the labeling certification kind of model. So we have two questions. One is about whether the digital infrastructure made of 100% fiber optics, FTTH, and Nextcloud everywhere, and would be a perfect frame. And I'll leave the expert answering on that. Frank, maybe, or others, would we have kind of an alternative to what a perfect infrastructure would look like?
I don't know. With all these discussions, I'm always have the opinion, gut feeling that we should not try to copy China or the US here, but find a European way. So the strength of Europe is that we are not centralized, that we have lots of different countries and languages and cultures and everything, diversity. For me, Europe is about diversity. And the solution for these tech problems also have to be, in my opinion, in a diverse way. So basically have an ecosystem, have an economy of lots of small, medium-sized players that work together, they compete with each other, and they can innovate and build up this infrastructure. And that's the same for the infrastructure with fiber and chip manufacturing and all the other basically low-level topics, but also on the more high level, like a software business, same what Nextcloud is doing. So I think this is something that we want. I don't think any initiative of like, I don't know, let's do one huge initiative, have one huge company which like is, I don't know, building everything up in Europe as a single player, as it works in China, right? It's centralized controlled, and the US is sometimes similar. I don't think that's a good idea. I think we should basically believe in our European values and use those as a strength to build the future.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Frank. Yeah. And congratulations for Nextcloud 23 that you have just released. That is a really great milestone. Super release. So answering to Estelle about the digital infrastructures. So I think that fiber optics, FTTH everywhere in all the houses, public institutions and companies is the best environment-friendly technology to the transmit data that we have today. So it's the best that we can have for environmental topics like electromagnetic radiations. You reduce electromagnetic radiations that are not good for health. We know it, and it's more secure also. So having solutions such as Nextcloud for the cloud or Selfish OS for mobile phones. You can have in Europe a superb digital infrastructure plus software, hardware that is open source, certified, and working for your you control and for the good. Okay, so this is we have the solutions. So also Li-Fi is interesting to transmit data from the light. Okay, with reduced effects on health. So because Wi-Fi is not neither something that is good for your health. So Li-Fi is better.
Thank you, Rodolphe, for explaining a little bit more with the technical background what you mean. But I think also Frank is pointing to a more kind of healthy ecosystem and the possibility of having competition. And I think we've made some progress in terms of interoperability in some of the legislation. I wanted to also pose a Jacqueline question about the impact of the future US antitrust legislation on some of the data protection, but also the platform regulations legislation. And we know that Google and other big tech are heavily lobbying against the US antitrust legislation. So anybody will want to take that, perhaps Estelle?
Sure, thank you. Yes, I think there is quite a lot of interesting development happening in the US in particular from their regulatory bodies. The US Congress is still quite inactive at the moment, even though interesting, bills are being proposed on a range of issues, but like concrete action is still, we're still waiting for meaningful changes. So changes in push conversation being done by the Federal Trade Commission, by several advocate general also in the US in addressing mostly competition, but issues that covers a wide range of other issues like privacy, like also the impact of specific technology on different communities will be really important. And I think there is still a need to make sure that those conversations are not solely happening from a perspective of competition, that they're a bit more comprehensive. But this is a bit the way things works in the US with the current model. There is a lot of sectoral protection, so a lot of the response might still be a little bit sectoral, but there is definitely a change of attitude happening from the regulatory bodies, and a change also that was initiated in a lot of US states, often linked to the lack of action by Congress, where quite a number of individual states have passed pretty good privacy legislation, also legislation banning certain types of facial recognition, doing legislation on biometric, et cetera, et cetera. So there are movement in the US. It's just we're missing a bit of more action in Congress, and where you can see obviously the impact on lobbying and the fact that a lot of companies are pushing back against action. But I think the way the conversation has been evolving, in particular on the FTC, in the public seeing of the big tech company and the power they hold in the US society is changing, which is something that even at the time of the Snowden revelation, that was not still there yet. People were appalled by the abuse that happened mostly by the public authority, by the NSA, but there was not at the time the conversation about, like, don't the company that actually do the initial collection also have too much power because of the collection that is happening. And so I do think we'll be getting closer and closer in those conversations, but it still is quite disappointing, I have to say, that we are in 2022. About more than 100 countries around the world have adopted really comprehensive legislation to protect privacy. And the US is still a huge outlier on that. And honestly, we need to be looking at the lobby of big tech in preventing this from happening, because privacy is a right in the US Constitution towards at least towards the public authority. So why would people not have similar rights to private actors? It's still a bit puzzling.
Thank you, Estelle. And also plugging here but this afternoon panel discussing the US and EU legislations, like the Digital Services Act, but also the newly introduced bill on surveillance, on banning surveillance advertising in the US, and what that could mean. Asking if Frank and Seda wanted to react to any of these points or questions. Otherwise, yeah, no?
I mean, I think I could take a stab at, like, thinking about what is a healthy ecosystem, and also kind of responding to the conversation with Rudolf and Frank. So I think it really is not just about replicating the infrastructure, but also what are we going to do with this technology? Like, what is it aimed for? I think it's important to remember that the cloud in the hands of big tech that we have right now is potentially an aberration in history, very much thanks to the 2008 financial crisis, right? With the meltdown of 2008, we have very few people who have shitloads of money now, and they took their money from housing markets and pushed them into tech, and then tech had to grow, and in that moment they held on to the cloud. So the cloud is a growth strategy, right? And so the question is, what does it mean to replicate that growth strategy in Europe? Does that mean that the governments have to push for that growth strategy? And remember, I said the growth strategy is about capturing institutions and gutting them out, right? Or scaling them up in ways, and we'll come back to the effects of that in a moment. So is the idea that the European cloud does the same thing, tries to attract investors, tries to push for growth, in the process gutting out institutions and giving individuals devices that are no longer personal devices in any way, but are controlled and managed, and building on a culture of software production that is absolutely dependent on that kind of mentality of managing millions of people in a controlled environment in the interest of financial outcomes, right? So I really think there's a big question to be asked before we start building fiber optic whatever and a massive cloud infrastructure that is only possible because we have super rich people that pumped money into big tech, right? What does it mean to use public funds to do that? I think that's a really hard and important question. And what are we going to do with that technology or that kind of computational power once we have it? And here I just want to put a parenthesis. The antitrust case does not question the computational power. It questions its concentration in the hands of a few. So it doesn't question the speedy production using agile methods, right? Like, it just says it shouldn't be owned by a few. And I don't know if we just replicate its production in Europe, we're going to get something different. And again, about the healthy ecosystem, I think it's really good that we use that term. We are dependent on a huge supply chain that has been mostly breaking down during COVID, and extraction of materials that pass through massive violations of fundamental rights and massive forms of exploitation that keeps inequality in the world in place. So it's really easy to start thinking about just us consuming services and how can we make these services not so dependent on big tech. But again, we have two problems. the production and the supply chain is optimized towards big tech because of their capital, right? Like they have immense amounts of money they can buy and therefore determine the direction of technology. We see this in microprocessors. Big tech has betted on specialized compute, which pushes forward machine learning and blockchain. Chip companies are producing towards them, right? Like, how are we going to change these supply chains, both to be more equitable and to also respond to our technological needs in terms of another vision? And finally, with machine learning, what these companies are doing is, pushing for scaled up services. And, many people have talked about the environmental impact of machine learning because of its data intensive and compute intensive intrinsic properties, but we think very little about the fact of using machine learning to scale up farming, potentially also killing not just diversity in humans, but diversity in agriculture, which causes a bunch of serious issues like the rise of viruses that produce pandemics, right? Like, so I think there's like a lot of questions to be asked about what we want to do with this technology and what is our vision. I don't know if sovereignty is the right word. I know a bunch of activists have picked up the concept of technological sovereignty to think about these questions, but how do we make sure that these technologies are not just serving market interests in Europe or regional or national interests in Europe while reproducing supply chains and extraction and exploitation, but actually producing technologies of life. So I think that's kind of my vision of a healthy ecosystem.
Thank you for that note, and also quite curious to see, how the growth strategy, not just of big tech, but also financial markets, like growing to Web3 or promoting crypto and NFTs. How would that impact our capacity in Europe to react to that? We will also try to, jump on the wagon and follow that race, or I think our discussions on the visions of technology on the planet, on people and democracy is quite important. So I wanted to actually give you the opportunity to close with that, right? In this complex geopolitical and economic environment and context, what are the political choices that we face as European citizens, as activists, and also for our institutions? You touch upon some, like the funding and our infrastructure choices, free and open software. What is your take and recommendation? Maybe starting with Frank.
Sure, thanks a lot. Most of the topics were already mentioned here. There's one more thing which was only briefly mentioned, is the antitrust case. I want to put some light on that topic. But this is not the only one. There are lots of actions that are needed. But antitrust is something which I think governments were, and this is the case, and Europe are too weak, in my opinion. It's clear that we have a concentration of power in big tech, and there are serious antitrust violations happening. It's just the governments are too slow and too weak, and this needs to change. One example is the antitrust complaint that we from Nextcloud submitted against Microsoft lately, end of last year. We submitted a year ago, but end of last year we went public with that. Which is about like using one monopoly position to gain an advantage in another one. It's clear. It's also communicated by the European Union that Microsoft has a monopoly on the operating system, on the desktop PC operating system market, and they use that to gain control to become the leader in another area, which is cloud collaboration space. They're bundling OneDrive directly into Windows. Windows 11 now has a Teams button directly in the taskbar. There are lots of integrations. So they're basically using one power position to get into the next one, the next one, next one. This is like monopoly behavior. This needs to be did by governments. I really wish governments would use their power and follow their responsibilities to go against this behavior.
Thank you. Estelle?
I would plus one the proposal made by SEDA of reclaiming our institution. I think in large sense of institution, this should be what drives our approach in Europe, our strategy of making sure social institutions remain at the service of people, for people, and thought in a way that they serve them the best. And to do that, this is where I add my own component to it, is that I do think Europe is still good at understanding some of the challenges and the issue and how people are being impacted by certain ecosystem at the moment and the way they don't necessarily function. And so even though in narrative and some framing, we may be falling in the trap of trying to follow other instead of doing our own path, but we're still putting forward legislations and changes that can be quite promising. But we usually fall through completely on how to enforce them. And this is where also we need to acknowledge there's a lot of conversation in Brussels about the lobby power of big tech around legislation being adopted. This lobby power doesn't stop when the law is adopted. This is one of the reasons why there's so many difficulties also in implementing GDPR. A lot of cases are being appealed for years on procedure grounds, on everything you can throw, because they have the means, those companies have the means to just make cases going on and on and on and drag forever. And so we don't feel the reality of those legislative and good political changes. And so it's to give a message maybe for the EU of like, at some point we'll have to stop creating new laws. We will have good structure, but we'll have to put all of the energies on making them a reality and enforcing them. And so that's why the action also many EDRI members like NAWB and others on making those legislation a reality will be so important, and just a cautionary tale for us to know that lobbying exists at all of those levels, and making a legislation is in fact just one step, even though that step sometimes takes 5 to 7 years. But it's really part, I think, of the reclaiming the institution and making sure the progress are delivered in a way that can serve people the best way.
Thank you for that reminder and for championing GDPR enforcement together with our other EDRI members. Seda, what is your ending note on our political and social choices?
Yeah, I think there's kind of like a double strategy. I think we have to tackle the dominance of big tech and also think about other practices at the same time, including in the way we reclaim institutions. So I just put a quote from the Technological Sovereignty project that was pulled together by a bunch of people also at Califu and activists who are doing some work also, for example, on 5G right now in Amsterdam. And, people are just trying to think of different ways of doing technology. And I think doing that different way of technology is really thinking hard from the problems that we're facing today and thinking about technology that addresses those instead of perpetuates big tech's technological practices, but in a European context. So I think that, we see this in, Moxie Marlinspike, who's, one of the main developers of Signal, wrote a Web 3.0 post, and he's like, this is going to be the alternative, but we're going to make it agile and microservices and going to update new features all the time. And you're like, okay, you're so confused, we can't help you. So I think, Frank's initiative here in Nextcloud is kind of interesting in terms of institutions and organizations at least taking a pause before they jump into the cloud infrastructures and mobile devices as their accessories. I think that kind of daily practice is really important, but we can't just be like, we used open source, therefore we're fine. And I know it's very difficult to even get that going, but we need to have a vision as to what is the future life form we want to have. And I think the little quote I have from the Technological Sovereignty initiative is very interesting. It says, if our desire is to bring about social change towards a more sustainable, collective and communal society, we must change the means, the resources, and the relationships that currently sustain society based on economic interests. And I hope we can go in that direction in the future. Thanks. Oh, and thanks for BBB. That's also part of the strategy. Awesome.
Thanks. Yes, and thanks for reminding us some of the more kind of structural changes we need and how fast things are going and how difficult it is even to catch up when it seems like the growth is just having new frontier every day. And also plugging here another discussion that I think Esthel's colleagues and Amnesty and Fight for the Future are having. It's a little late on the European side, but they're having a conversation more on the human rights implication of Web3. And I'm sure that we will continue these discussions on this side of the Atlantic too. There's been a few other interesting points about the role of Apple and other big tech companies, but I think unless there are any other burning statements from the panelists or questions, we will close here with this vision for Europe. And I will want to really thank Estelle, Frank, and Seda for this interesting and vast conversation. Thank you all for attending, and looking forward to other Privacy Camp discussions and also other very interesting topics. Thank you so much, and see you and continuing these discussions very soon.